Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. A recent report card from the state of South Dakota shows that although most students are completing high school, about half are not proficient in key subjects or ready for college, a juxtaposition that the state education agency called complicated. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what insights does this state report card give?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it really gets into sort of the tension between some of these proficiency rates and some of these the assessment data that states acquire for a number of different reasons. But really, there is a lot of there is a push for the state data through federal legislation. Right, states have to track how students are doing over time, and they have to have this assessment data, and that's a way that you can determine whether a school is doing well, whether students are learning, and sort of is it a perfect system to track what students know? Not necessarily. There's been quite a bit of criticism about some of these high stakes tests, but it is, the system that we have to kind of track year over year, like what do students know? How well are they learning it? And there's a tension there, I think, between graduation rates, which one researcher at one point described as one of the most fungible metrics for school districts. And I was talking with him about the COVID graduating class during COVID, and some of those students who were graduating, even though, they had their learning incredibly disrupted by the pandemic, and, were testing at all-time lows in terms of proficiency. So I think this kind of illustrates that disconnect a little bit of here's what the state says the students are ready for, or this is how many students are ready for college and career, 54%, versus how many are completing high school. And so basically, I think the question is why? Like, why is there this disconnect? Why is there this massive jump? I mean, that's 54% versus 91% is, it's like the cup is half empty or it's almost all the way full. I mean, that's kind of the divide there. So why is there a gap? And I think that the Department of Education tried to explain it a little bit. They called it complicated. And I think that's, one of those things like, yeah, when you start looking at the specifics of the stuff, it does get a little bit complicated. But, what they kind of said is statewide testing that is, regulated by the state, and the graduation rate is the local level. So that's individual teachers, that's individual administrators. And that is not necessarily, dictated by the state. I think that there are graduation requirements, but as I've written about quite a bit, you have things like credit recovery that allow students to get the classes that they need to graduate, but maybe they're not having as rigorous of an education as they would otherwise in a different class that's in person, that is remedial. You're taking Algebra 1 again because you failed it the first time because you had learning disruption in middle school because of COVID, right? There's a lot of different kinds of factors here. And again, it does get complicated. That is true. And again, too, the South Dakota specifically has different metrics for college and career readiness. They have two different kinds of benchmarks essentially to determine whether kids are ready for life after graduation, like coursework and assessment benchmarks. And so there's different kinds of ways that students can show, hey, I've learned what I need to. Like, it's through career and technical education. Like you can say, hey, I'm ready for the workforce right after high school, or I have these test scores that show that I'm ready for college. And again, it gets complicated. How much does that specific career and readiness score show that you are actually ready for college? And there's been some research that's been done on that. But there is this disconnect, I think, between like, here's what kids are able to do. We've seen this with test scores. In Detroit, for example, where the graduation rates were very high in a number of high schools, but you looked at what the kids were performing at the year before, 11th grade students were performing at the year before, and even the year of, and it's dismal. Like the students are not at the state level for proficiency and are far behind their peers statewide. And so it raises the question, like, why is there that discrepancy? And I think, there's in that case, the Detroit Public Community School District, said like, hey, we stand behind our grading systems, and this is kind of, the way that we do things here. We have, our students are learning, but also, these are the test scores that we have. So again, it's like one of those things of like, it's complicated, right? There's some of these discrepancies there that are not clearly, spoken about. And I think we need to keep asking the question of like, why do those exist? Are the metrics that we're using for college and career readiness good? Do they adequately describe like how students are going to fare in the workforce. And there's, that research I was mentioning from All for Ed. It's an organization, and basically getting into some of the nuts and bolts of like, well, if South Dakota says 54% of students are college ready, how many students actually have to take remedial classes in college? And, they found that it was in some cases lower than the percentage who were maybe estimated to have that. So like that also plays a factor of like, what if your benchmarks are, skewed a little bit? And that's again, like kind of this complicated nature of, trying to get the right cut scores and trying to, make these benchmarks and try to do that. And it gets very dicey in terms of the data assessment and analysis. And we don't have to get into all of that here, just to know that like it is complicated, but at the same time, like we should be asking the question, do students have what they need to be successful in life, as they graduate? And unfortunately, what I've heard from teachers is that students are not really learning as much as they need to be in order to be successful, and they are graduating because they have access to these courses, or they have some kind of forgiveness. And specifically in the case of COVID-19, school districts were saying we need to get the students out the door to get the other students in. And it's kind of unfortunate that we had this disruption, but there's not really much that we can do about it, and we have to just let them go. And even had that kind of the researcher called it the COVID credentials, again, like the way to describe like a class of students who do not have as much knowledge under their belt, has not learned as much as their predecessors because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they still have like, okay, I graduated from high school, right? So it's kind of that complicated nature there of like they did graduate, they technically are out there, but do they know as much as the people who did 5 years before the pandemic? That's sort of the question.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.